You're listening to the Vocabbett podcast, where I help students improve their vocabulary for the SAT, ACT, and life itself using my unique and research-backed story-based method. On this podcast, I'm sharing the best tips and tricks for a more enriched vocabulary and pain-free test day. Hello, and welcome to episode 63 of the Vocabbett podcast. I'm Erica Abbott, a former English and history teacher, the author of the young adult novel Ahead of Her Time, and the founder of the eponymously named vocabulary company Vocabbett. I can already tell you that this episode and the next episode are two of my favorite episodes this season, and there's a lot of history in this one in particular, so if you're not a Vocabbett member yet, I highly suggest heading over to vocabbett.com to get a membership so you get the video that goes with this episode. The word we're going to talk about today is academy. And you might be thinking, well, I already know what an academy is, so this can't be that hard, can it? But one of the things I'm trying to teach you is to see words as stories. Every word comes from somewhere, and if you start listening to the words, they can tell you so much. And this one gives me an excuse to talk about 3 different periods of Greek history, including my favorite villain, so indulge me for a minute. The word academy, if you can believe it, goes all the way back to the story of the minotaur, a mythological Greek monster that was half man, half bull. It lived in a giant maze called the labyrinth, and every 7 or so years, depending on the story that you're reading, King Minos of Crete would feed 7, again, the number can change depending on which version you're reading, but King Minos of Crete would feed 7 of the best and brightest Athenians to this minotaur. This all started because King Minos' son was killed in a hunting accident by an Athenian, so this was his way of exacting revenge. So the Athenians are obviously terrified every time there's a reaping, and yes, this is where the story of the Hunger Games originated. But during one of these reapings, there was a young man living in Athens named Theseus. And Theseus wants to be a hero. He's got a cousin, Hercules, who's already out there making a name for himself, and Theseus knows he needs to catch up. So when Minos' boats sail into Athens, and everyone else is trying to look invisible, Theseus volunteers as tribute. Everyone is like, oh my gods, Theseus, you are so sweet to sacrifice your life for someone else, to go die at the hands of the Minotaur. And Theseus is like, no, I'm gonna go kill the Minotaur and you're all gonna talk about what a hero I am. And they're like, okay, well, good luck, bye. So Theseus gets to Crete, an island south of Greece, and the details here are kind of fuzzy, but somehow he catches the eye of the daughter of the king, Ariadne. And Ariadne is so struck by him, she runs up to her dad and is like, oh, daddy, please don't feed him to a monster. And King Minos is like, Ariadne, he deserves it because he's Athenian and they suck. So Ariadne decides to take matters into her own hands. After dinner one night, she stops Theseus in a shadowy corridor and passes him 2 things, a sword and a string. The next morning, the prisoners are marched into the labyrinth. Theseus has hidden his gifts underneath his cloak, but once they get into the labyrinth, he busts out his sword, busts out the string, and tells the other Athenians to get behind him. He starts unfurling the string as they're walking through the labyrinth, hunting the Minotaur. Eventually, he finds the monster, kills it, then uses the string to trace their way back to the entrance, because remember, it was a maze. And you might think I'm downplaying the action here a little bit, but honestly, I feel like this probably wasn't the hardest monster to kill. The Minotaur was used to being fed, basically. Here are your unarmed, terrified Athenians. And so the fact that Theseus had a sword would kind of be like if your sandwich all of a sudden had a sword. I don't know how prepared the Minotaur was for this battle. But anyway, the Athenians are like, oh my gosh, Theseus, what a hero. We love you, Theseus. And that's where the story of Theseus and the Minotaur ends for most people. But I am a completist, and you can probably tell already that I am not Theseus's biggest fan. After Theseus slayed the Minotaur, King Minos was obviously furious, determined to figure out who gave him the sword and the string. Ariadne knows she's this close to getting exiled or executed, so she runs over to Theseus and she's like, take me with you. And Theseus is like, of course, my love, you saved me. You saved us all. Marry me and hop aboard my ship. Everyone swoons over what a proper hero he is. So they're sailing home, Theseus and the Athenians and Ariadne, and everyone is treating Ariadne like their future queen. They've got her all comfortable with all these pillows and blankets and everything. They stop on the island of Naxos and they bring her ashore, again, making sure she's super comfortable. She falls asleep while they're picking up food and whatever else. And when she wakes up, she sees Theseus's ship sailing away in the distance. Yes, my friends, Theseus ditched Ariadne on a random island. And to be fair, the Athenians claim this isn't exactly how it happened. The Athenians claim that Ariadne was taking a nap, and while she was doing that, a huge storm blew Theseus' ship away, with obviously all the guys inside of it. He didn't leave her on purpose, a storm just blew them away. But everyone else has basically accepted the fact that Theseus is just a terrible person. He never went back for her, that storm didn't last his entire life. Ariadne just wasn't useful anymore, so he ditched her. Now, there are a lot of Aeus names in antiquity, Theseus, Perseus, Odysseus, whatever. I used to get Theseus and Perseus mixed up, but now I always remember Theseus because I think of him as Theseus the pig. Theseus, T-H-E, Theseus the pig. I can't stand him. Things ended up okay for Ariadne, by the way. The god Dionysus spotted her crying alone on Naxos, and he's the god of wine and parties. So he goes down and he's like, hey, let's just stomp on some grapes. Life is good. They start dancing, get married. He actually brings her up to Mount Olympus, according to some versions of the story, which is pretty rare for a god to actually marry a mortal and immortalize her. So she did just fine. The pig, on the other hand, continues being an opportunistic fiend, and this is where the word academy is going to come in. Theseus does become king when he gets back to Athens. He gets a wife, she dies, now he needs a new one. So he and a buddy make a pact that their next wives are going to be daughters of Zeus. Theseus sets his sights on a Spartan girl named Helen, who will later be known as Helen of Troy, but she's only about 10 years old at this point. Theseus and his buddy kidnap her from the temple where she was praying and then drop her off with Theseus' mom. Theseus is like, hey mom, we just have one more person to kidnap. Do you mind watching Helen for me until she's old enough to marry? Thanks, love you, bye. Then Theseus and his buddy sneak down into the underworld because his friend decided that his next wife should be Persephone, who was already married, by the way, to Hades. These poor women. Persephone has her own story too, but I can't even go there right now. Anyway, back in the land of the living, Helen's family obviously notices that she's gone. Her brothers, Castor and Pollux, raise the Spartan army and are straight up ready to burn Athens to the ground to find her. The Athenians are obviously terrified, coming up against the Spartan army, and their king isn't even there to lead them because he's in the underworld being an absolute creep. Just when it seems that all of Athens is going to get the Carthage treatment, a man named Academies shows up. In his wisdom, Academies tells his fellow Athenians, this is not our fight. He gets them to lay down their arms and, shaking a little bit, walks over to the Spartan camp. He tells Castor and Pollux exactly where Helen is hidden, and in the process, saves Athens. The Spartans take Helen back and agree to leave. Throughout all of this, Academies won the respect of both the Athenians and the Spartans. The Athenians were so grateful that he managed to avert an absolute devastating war. They gave him all of these beautiful olive trees, and in the future, when there was conflict between Sparta and Athens, the Spartans always respected his property and never touched his land. After Academies' death, his land continued to be extremely beautiful, and it was still known as the Groves of Academies. Eventually, Plato started lecturing there, and his school basically grew out of that name. Where do you teach? Where are you going? To the academy. Academies' place. Eventually, other people wanted to be like Plato's students, so they formed their own academies. Even though it wouldn't have originally made sense, because it's like saying we're going to Academies' place, that's how language evolves. If you're curious what happened to Theseus, by the way, Hades was none too pleased at the amateurish effort to steal his wife. He tortured Theseus and his friend for months. Eventually, Hercules wandered down into the underworld on one of his labors and freed Theseus, because remember, they're cousins. But no matter what Hercules said, Hades would not let Theseus' friend go, because it was the friend who wanted to take his wife. So anyway, Theseus gets back up into the fresh air, finds Helen gone, finds his mom gone. That was the one thing that the Spartans did in retaliation. They said, all right, we're taking your mom too, because remember, the mom had been kind of holding Helen hostage. They made Theseus' mom be Helen's handmaiden, basically her servant for more or less the rest of her life. But yeah, Theseus gets back, basically finds everything not as he expected it. And eventually someone got so sick of him, he pushed him off a cliff. Might have been me, traveling back through time. But who would have thought all of these fancy academies get their name from the guy who saved Helen from having to become Theseus' wife? I can keep going forever. But like I said, this is the same Helen who will eventually become Helen of Troy from the Trojan War. The most beautiful woman in the world, the woman whose face launched 1,000 ships. Words are so fascinating. They hold so much human history in them. And sometimes even in fancy academies, you'll find stories of monsters and betrayal and danger. I'll be back with a shorter but equally fascinating story next time about the word blatherskite and how American soldiers used it during the Revolutionary War to kind of tease the British. But there's so much more to it than that. There's a really cool song that goes with it, and you'll definitely want to tune in. I will see you there.